Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome here. Good morning to those who are watching this a little bit later. We welcome you here on this Ash Wednesday, March 5th, 2025, for our first Wednesday webinar for the Faithful Leadership in the Climate Crisis cohort. It's a lot of letters, and we're so excited that you're here. We're excited that you're tuning in post-event, and we're excited to be having this conversation. I wanted to start with just a little moment of breathing. For those in the East, it's already late morning. For those of us in central locations, we're mid-morning. And for those who are calling in from the West, it's early. So just take a minute, put your feet on the ground. If you haven't already done so today, close your eyes and take a deep breath. Take a breath in. Sigh it out. And notice that your feet are on the ground, and imagine your roots going down, down, down through the ground, the floor, whatever it is you're on today. You are rooted, we are rooted as a community. We know that plants growing outside, trees are connected underground, and we are also connected to one another through invisible but very tangible networks of connection. We're connected through our faith family, and we're connected through our care for the planet that we live on and the people on it and the biodiverse everything. We care, and we're here today to see what we can do about that. Thank you for all these. Be thankful for all these connections. Open your eyes. Look at somebody on the screen. If you can make eye contact on the screen, do that. Here we are together. Thank you for coming. We also acknowledge that we are on lands across this country that have been cared for and continue to be cared for and protected by Indigenous siblings. And we're grateful for their care, and we commit to continuing to work towards good relationship with our Indigenous brothers and sisters across the land. I wanted to read to you this morning. I'll introduce myself. I'm Sandy Plett, Climate Action Coordinator for Mennonite Church Canada, and today I'm hosting you with Doug Kaufman. Doug, you can wave. You'll get a chance to introduce yourself in a bit. From Anna Baptist Climate Collaborative, Executive Director. And our guest today is Anna Vogt from Mennonite Central Committee. She'll have a chance to say more in a little bit as well. But just to open our thinking, I'm reading today from Doris Jansen Longacre's Living More with Less, one of my favorite books and a go-to when I need something to share. So I'm going to read to you. This book was written in 1970. I think it was published in 75. I could be off by a year. So today we're talking about advocacy, and Doris was talking about this a long time ago. So this is a book about small actions, but this is how she talks about that. The heading is Simple Living Isn't Enough. I don't apologize for the seeming unimportance of individual entries which make up this book. All of us should walk more, save hot water, use less aluminum foil. These are small ideas, small acts, but they offer a realistic place to start. Doing justice, however, demands much more. The message here is mainly one of first steps. This collection is about putting our own houses in order. Yet in that process, we invariably move on to economic and political issues. Actually, the two realms, conserving resources at home and taking on economic and political issues, are as inseparable as the yolk and white of a scrambled egg. It never works to say, I'll stop using paper towels and driving a big car, but I won't take this world hunger thing past my doorstep. Once an egg yolk breaks into the white, there's no way to remove every tiny gold fleck. Just so, once you walk into a supermarket or pull up to a gas pump, you are part of the economic and political sphere. Certainly, your influence is small, but whether you conserve or waste, it is real. Many people using or not using affects things in a big way. Gathering up the fragments of our waste, recycling, conserving, sharing is a logical and authentic beginning. Such actions are the first fruits of the harvest of justice. They are the promise of more to come. And for the sake of the poor and the hungry, that's good. Solutions for their needs will come primarily through economic and political change. That's Doris Jensen Longacre and Living More with Less. I want to welcome you here again and just say we're so excited to be together with this group. We have lots to talk about, lots to think about. We have projects to share and yeah, work to do. So it's good that you're here. I don't know that there's any housekeeping except if we notice that your mic is making noise, we might check into that. But other than that, I'm going to hand things over to Doug to introduce our guest for today. So go ahead, Doug.
I might just add one bit of housekeeping.
Oh, yeah.
If you already said this, but Anna will be speaking for about the next hour, and then we will give everyone time to. Everyone will probably get about 3 minutes. Depends on, and I'll have a timer and everything. I just wanted to let you know we're going to invite you to share about your project. So everyone's going to have a project over this time, and we would like a 2 to 3 minute summary about what you're working on. And if you don't have your project in mind quite yet, let us know where you're going with that. But I wanted to get that out.
Thanks.
Yes, and I'm joining you from Goshen, Indiana. And while this is primarily a Canadian group, I'm not the only one south of the border. And it's good to have Anna Vogt with us, coming to us from Ottawa, Ontario. She's the Director of Advocacy and Public Policy for MCC Canada Peace and Justice Office. She started working with MCC as part of the SEED program in the Montes de Maria in Colombia. And there she learned about local level advocacy, accompanying displaced communities, advocating for their rights as victims of Colombia's armed conflict. She also worked in communications with Justapaz, a Mennonite organization in Bogota, supporting human rights documentation. And most recently, before this, she worked for MCC regionally in Latin America, engaging in advocacy and public policy work around issues of migration and peace building before finally coming back to Canada. She is, I don't know if you're called the North American or the Canadian representative. I know several North Americans on the Mennonite World Conference Creation Care Task Force. So that's another significant role that she has. And I'll just do a little advertisement. I guess I didn't really introduce myself. I'm Doug Kaufman, Executive Director of Anabaptist Climate Collaborative. We did a project with them. I may link it in the chat, where we have about 40 stories that we've told from across the globe. That was a project that Anabaptist Climate Collaborative did with Mennonite World Conference. And actually, it's about to come out in Spanish and French, and maybe even Dutch. But right now it's in English. So thank you, Anna, for coming with us to share, and go ahead and take it from here.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a real honor to get to be with all of you and to connect. And I know Doug said I'm going to be speaking for about an hour. I hope that I'm not actually speaking for about an hour. I'd love to also hear from you and hope that we can kind of learn together as we think about what advocacy looks like and what it is and how churches connect. I am especially always grateful for when I get to kind of step out of my Ottawa world and think about how advocacy impacts and connects and engages local congregations and spaces, because it's easy for me to kind of get stuck in a little bit of that federal level policy sphere and talk, but then to actually get to connect with the reality of what this work looks like and that messy creative spaces within churches. So I want to hear as well from all of you as we're going. I'm going to be sharing some pieces that might be a little bit technical as well about federal level advocacy and spaces for engagement. But I hope that we're also able to kind of share and learn from each other as we go. So I just want to actually pause and just hear your first reactions when I throw out the word advocacy. Like, kind of what thoughts or feelings or emotions come to mind, and just feel free to unmute and just share a word or a sentence or two when it comes to advocacy, and especially advocacy in your context. Yeah, Laura, I see you unmuted. Yeah, just go ahead.
Online petitions and armchair activism.
to some extent, it reminds me of some of the Old Testament prophets who stepped forward and were critical or corrective of the political leadership and the religious leadership of the time.
We've got that range of like armchair activists, computer screens, but also that prophetic voice or call.
I'll just say that for me, because I make an annual pilgrimage to Washington, DC and talk to legislators face to face, so that's probably the first thing that I think of.
Engagement with policymakers.
I think
Anybody else?
also helping to like amplify voices that that might not be heard otherwise.
So not even working from kind of our own concerns, but also the concerns of others who may not have that same chance to engage.
I have a bit of an emotional response. I think I'm getting more comfortable, but coming into sort of the climate conversation only about 5 or 6 years ago, there's some anxiety related to advocacy in the sense that it conjures up images of conflict. And I'm so pleased that I've had a few experiences of joining in with experienced advocates where it is not about conflict, but about conversation. And that, to me, it's like hopeful about directing our, well, for me, it can take that emotional part and say, actually, it's something I really love, which is conversation. But there is this fraughtness sometimes when we start to talk about advocacy.
Well, almost that first initial like gut feeling in your stomach of like, oh no, like climate change advocacy, and how to move from almost that anxiety to this is just a conversation. But that process of doing it.
For me, it's in recent years mostly about joint letters and joint attempts to meet with legislators, and quite honestly, hitting brick walls.
Well,
Yes.
I think
And wondering, is it really worth bothering with these conservatives who just, you know, follow what is written on a piece of paper that they've been given by their leadership and don't even think?
Yeah, so just enormous amounts of efforts trying to collaborate, work with others. And then I think my hand automatically started doing this, like, and then it's just like, boom, nothing. Here's a wall. And then that feeling of also like effort with no impact, and that we just put a lot of work into this. And is this even worth the time and energy that we're doing it?
and I think for me, it's also a little bit of exhaustion in the message. I seem to hear the same message over and over and over and over, and there's a lot of vinegar in it. I'm looking for a hopeful message to inspire me rather than a vinegar message to guilt me into action.
Yeah, that how do we inspire with possibilities rather than shame with despair? If that seems accurate to what you're mentioning. But that sometimes even figuring out our framing message is our biggest challenge. Anybody else? 1 or 2 more voices. Advocacy. What does it kind of conjure up for you when you hear that word? Or what do you think the folks in your church also respond or feel when they hear that word? You've all shared quite a few, I think, from your perspective as church leaders. What about your congregants?
I have a little bit of experience working at a advocacy project back home. I was working with World Vision for 15 years in Sri Lanka, and we were engaged in program, an advocacy program from the grassroots level, we're trying to ensure the voices are heard of the communities. And this was a project that was initiated by the UN, which was called the End Violence Against Children, the EVAC project. So that's the kind of experience I had with advocacy. So I was closely working with the communities and working with the children, and we led some projects, some research projects, which was said child and youth led advocacy programs. So I was so that's for me. It is about ensuring the voices are heard of the most vulnerable communities. So that's what counts for me when I talk about advocacy.
Yeah, I think that connects well. I think what Laura was saying as well, like who are we representing when we're in those spaces, and how are we ensuring as well that when we're in those advocacy spaces, it's not just about us, but that we're actually able to speak about the issues that those who are maybe the most marginalized and are the most vulnerable are facing. And so it's also not us in it alone. So how are we ensuring that we're communicating accurately, that we're bringing in those experiences and perspectives into those spaces?
So just following on from what Mark said, I think Mark and I sometimes experience the same things when we hit these walls. And I mean, Mark said and used the word thinking, that, you know, he questions, you know, what the line of thinking is when these people are just going by the script that they've been given. And it frustrates me to the point that I kind of wonder, you know, what are these people thinking? But do they know what they should be thinking about? Do they have the background or the you know, have they been educated to the point that they know what the impact and results might be of their not thinking? And so I sometimes wonder, how do we achieve, you know, um, filling that gap in their consciousness about what this is all about.
Yeah, well, and I think this is such a pivotal piece of advocacy as well. As we get this opposition, there seems to be a wall, and then how do we identify what the actual barrier is that the person we're trying to communicate is facing? Is it a lack of knowledge? Is it not having access to resources? Is it being told they have to follow this script? But how to even identify what is that barrier? And then how can we help address that barrier is, I think, some of our greatest challenges. Is it information? Is it ideology? And how do we communicate that well? Anybody else? Okay, I think that these are all really helpful, and just this helpful reminder that both the rational side of us and our emotional side is involved when we're doing this. That we're working. Oh, sorry, Laura, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to add too that there seems to be some like confusion too for us as Mennonites about like engaging politically because of well, like not wanting to be seen as like siding with a particular party, but then when you actually start looking at the policies, like sometimes you have clear alignment with some parties and not others, and then like how to, yeah, it becomes complicated.
Yeah, and especially things that appear public, right?
Yeah.
And then how are we, even if we're being really careful that we're not naming a party, we're not siding with the party, that, well, perception as well of, well, you're obviously on the left or you're on the right, or and how to navigate that when all of our work as Anabaptists, as humans, is political, but when it becomes politicized.
Yeah, and wanting to work against polarization in our
Yeah.
communities as well, at like simultaneously. And even some confusion, like I was surprised when I took on this like mission, peace, and justice position to learn like that technically as a charity, like I'm supposed to be tracking the number of hours that I spend on political activities, but like as you know, Sandy with your reading at the beginning, like what is a political activity? Like if everything is a political activity, what is a political activity? So yeah, some of my questions.
Yeah. Well, I hope that we can dive deep into some of these things. I don't necessarily have answers to them. I think I can talk about being a registered lobbyist, but that's really different than how do we navigate our churches well in politicized contexts in ways that strive for peace and justice and also reduce harms in our own community. And I think I'll be frank, that's something that we are wrestling with as MCC all the time. How to uphold the voices that we're hearing and the impacts that we see of global policies, and also respond well to tensions in our communities at home. And so I think I want to start by just, I've tossed around the word MCC a lot, but just I'm going to share my screen, just talk a little bit about who is MCC and why do we do this work? Just to even ground me in where I'm coming from and the hat that I'm wearing as I'm sharing today. And everyone can see my screen and they can just see the presenter view, right? Just to double check.
Yeah.
Awesome. So MCC is a worldwide ministry of Anabaptist churches. We're grateful, which means it includes you, and we're grateful to work with all of you in this work. And we share God's love and compassion for all in the name of Christ by responding to basic human needs and working for peace and justice. And that really this is the goal of our advocacy work, is envisioning communities worldwide in right relationship with God, one another, and creation. And so MCC works in about 40 countries around the world, including the US and Canada, where we work on projects including relief in times of disaster or conflict, development work, looking at healthcare, schools, education. And then we also work a lot on peace building, which is often where I see some of this right relationship that our value added as MCC sometimes in the world of humanitarian organizations is our focus on peace. And that we do strive for kind of both this holistic picture. We don't always get it right. We've been operating for over 100 years, and I think we can point to places where there's been amazing work that has been done, and also places where we continue to learn and to think about how do we want to do things different, but with that goal of right relationships. And I think for us over the last few years, although as Sandy's reminded us, even with some of that more with less work, this is not new to think about our relationships with creation. But just seeing that climate change impacts all of the work that we're doing. And that it's when we talk to partners, MCC works with partners around the world. So we're not generally direct implementers, but rather working with local agencies, often churches or Mennonite or Anabaptist organizations, that we're hearing about the impacts of climate change. So just even one simple example of this man on my screen is Jose Hernandez, and he's a farmer from the community of Zapote, Guatemala. And so MCC supports a partner in Guatemala, Pastoral de la Tierra, that kind of supports permaculture work in communities like Jose Hernandez's, who are increasingly talking about the impacts of climate change. They may not always use the direct phrase climate change, but talking about how it becomes much harder to know how to plant, when to harvest, droughts are longer, floods are suddenly unexpected, and just seeing the rippling impacts, especially in areas that are already suffering from impacts of poverty or armed conflicts, and how we often talk about climate change as a risk multiplier. But then we can also highlight the work that communities are also doing to respond to climate change. That we see partners like the one that works in Jose community that are working on looking at more resilient seeds, looking at different forms of food systems, and also working on forms of community organizing. The community that Jose Hernandez works in is also a community that's been heavily impacted by a Canadian mining company. And that has also further led to environmental harms that then combined with climate change make life difficult. And so that the community itself has done local advocacy to engage in responding. But we've got a variety of stories and voices asking MCC and saying climate change is something that impacts us in our community, and that it also impacts us in Canada. We were just talking before you all started to join about the changing weather patterns in Canada. And I live in Ottawa. We're famous for our Rideau skating canal. And for the last few years, we haven't been able to go skating. And so recognizing climate change and climate change advocacy is both something that happens somewhere else that impacts our global neighbors, and it also impacts us. And that we are then in spaces to respond based on those impacts and also based on our responsibilities. We think about emissions, we think about carbon footprint, and how do we, again, respond on those tangible, practical levels of greening our churches, but also thinking about our responsibilities as in terms of our own carbon footprints and how that calls us to advocate, but not out of necessarily a sense of despair, but out of hope that we see communities like the ones in Guatemala responding and working. And what can we learn from that response and work as we also respond? So over the last few years, that's been a focus for MCC, has been thinking about climate change and supporting partners, and then also engaging in advocacy. And so I'm centered in Ottawa. I work in the Peace and Justice Office. Our tagline is Anabaptist Advocacy for Peace, Justice, and Human Dignity, where we take the stories that we're hearing from our partners and we bring them to policymakers, and we also bring them to MCC supporters and say, how can we respond through our donations and also through volunteering, through praying, and then also through advocating as a way of responding to, again, that vision of right relationships. And I like to think of creation care also as creating something new. That how are we creating together? And how does that also lead us to learn together and to speak politically? And so our office is turning 50 this year. And so we've been working a variety of different directors, different changes, different focus areas, but really trying to think about what are we hearing from MCC partners? Where is there a space where the Canadian government also has a responsibility? And when are we asking the Canadian government to stop doing something? And when are we also providing them the opportunity to take leadership in doing something new and leading in a way forward? And I love this work because there's a lot of space for creativity. And to think about, again, that sense of right relationships and right relationships with decision makers as well. And then we often, when we're talking about our work, think about this verse from Micah 6:8, which I think is probably one that's familiar to all of us. But what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And how does our advocacy work kind of touch on all of those points? To act justly, to seek justice, but to also love mercy, to think about the capacity that we think change is possible. And that's kind of where some of the heart of our restorative justice work comes from as well, that we don't think anybody is beyond change or redemption, and that we try to take that spirit with us when we're engaging. And to walk humbly with our God. Where are we being called to engage? And so I think this is something as a team that we spend time wrestling with or thinking about as we look at issues as complex as climate change and their impacts. And then that advocacy is the space that we're positioned to engage in. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now, and I'm gonna ask you a series of questions around what is advocacy? And I'd love you to, it's a little bit harder to figure out where we land on a spectrum in a Zoom space, but I'm gonna read a sentence and I'm gonna ask you if you think that's advocacy. And if you strongly believe that it's advocacy, I'd love you to put your hand up. So to use your kind of your virtual hand. And then if you are kind of don't think something is advocacy, I'm going to ask you to, let me see, what effect will I get you to do? I'm going to ask you to do the open mouth reaction. So it's not a direct correlation, but you strongly believe something is advocacy. I'd love you to just use the raise hand function. You do not think this is advocacy. I'd like you to do the open mouth advocacy. And you're kind of in the middle on the fence, not sure. Just don't respond at all. Okay, so writing a personal blog about the impact of addressing climate change. Hands up if you definitely think this is advocacy, or thumbs up. Yep. Tim, I see. Mark, you're kind of saying definitely not advocacy. Yeah, I see some more hands, thumbs up. I'd love to just, for someone who put your hand up right away, if you just want to unmute and say, why do you think this is advocacy? You write a personal blog about the importance of addressing climate change. So for someone who responded, this is advocacy, unmute and share your thoughts about why this is advocacy.
I say advocacy is also about educating. So it's important to educate the community. So
raising awareness.
Yeah.
As part of advocacy. And for some of, I think I saw one kind of open mouth face, or yeah, Joel, go ahead.
No,
Is
I
it Joel?
think- Yes, Yoel. I think it's important. I think even though you're writing the blog, it's a part of taking action for the course, the ideas that you bring it on, and you, at least in that writing, you know, giving some inference, you know, for people to decide. So
Influencing and taking action are part of that. Who was less convinced that this was advocacy? Mark, I think I saw you put the open mouth faced.
Yeah, I guess I have in my mind a sort of separation between talking to the powerful and talking to people in general. And I see advocacy as talking to the powerful.
So that distinction around who is our audience?
Yeah.
Who are we trying to convince and who has power or not? Okay, anyone else have a thought or a comment around this one? Craig.
Yeah, for me, I think it was connected more to, I look at blogs as passive and as personal opinion. And so it's no different than writing an op-ed in a newspaper or something. And I would hope for advocacy to have a little bit more integrity than just personal opinion or an op-ed. That it would be, yeah, I haven't completely formed it, but that was my gut reaction.
Yeah. So that it's less about personal opinion. And this is just kind of putting our personal opinion out in the world. Okay. Oh, Dieter, go ahead.
Craig, what if you had a big major following though?
So does your level of influence matter?
That's a good question, Dieter. I haven't thought about that. I guess for me, I don't have a very big personal following. I write a letter to my congregation in a week, and I think about a quarter of the congregation reads it. So it's a very small following. And so I take, maybe it's the Mennonite humility in me saying is my voice doesn't have that big an impact in a blog or that kind of sphere. If I was a major influencer, that might be a bit of a different story, I suppose.
So that question though around influence, where do we have influence? How big of an influence is part of kind of that question. Let me ask you another one. So you organize or attend a candlelight vigil for climate migrants. So attend or organize a candlelight vigil for climate migrants. Is this advocacy? Raise your hand or give me a thumbs up. Definitely not advocacy, or you're on the fence. Okay. And same question for those of you that raised your hand. Why is this advocacy? And for those of you that are on the fence as well, I see that there were a number of folks who didn't say anything.
I think if it's a public vigil, you're still, it's still part of like raising awareness in the broader community, raising the profile of an issue and helping to kind of, yeah, highlights or amplify the voices of people who might not be heard otherwise.
Yeah, so again, that idea of like publicity, awareness raising, amplifying.
Yeah, and kind of helping to shape public opinion, maybe like if you're a faith leader attending something like that or organizing it, it kind of adds like a moral weight to the issue.
Anybody else? Especially those of you that are on the fence.
To me, I mean, for the reasons I identified earlier, it depends on the location. If it's outside the MP's office, it's advocacy.
So again, who's the audience here, I think is what I'm hearing you say, Mark. And how are we impacting them?
Well, and I also think about whether the media is being engaged. Like, have you invited the media to be there? I thought about that with Craig. To me, if it's in the newspaper, then it is more like advocacy than in a blog, at least if it's a wide circulation newspaper.
Well, I also wonder the question a little bit of who's it for, and what like when you started with organizing a candlelight vigil, I was like, okay, I'm not sure about this, and then you added like for climate migrants on the back end, and like this is like I looked at this as two pieces as you were saying it, because is a vigil, I look at it from a perspective of, is attending the vigil a way for me to express grief or enter into a moment of worship or something like that? I have a hard time connecting worship and advocacy, and maybe that's where one of my growing edges is. Yeah, I'm on the fence because I can see both sides of this one, and I'm not sure where I land. But part of it is, for those who are attending this vigil, is it a way of expressing grief or remorse or expressing some internal feeling, or is it amplifying other voices? Like, where do you place yourself in the continuum on this particular activity?
Mm-hmm. So what's the goal of the activity, and how is that being formulated or expressed in the activity itself might determine whether something is advocacy or not. Okay, let me move on to the next one. You set up a fundraiser for climate change projects at your church. Is this advocacy? Definitely not advocacy, or you're on the fence about this one, but a fundraiser for climate change projects at your church. Okay, someone who, yeah, anyone want to share your response and why you picked it?
Well, I mean, I think I tend not to think of these things as black and white in terms of advocacy or not advocacy. I mean, this certainly has components of advocacy in it. You're doing something in the public which highlights the need for improvements, and you're actually making changes and asking folks to participate in those changes by contributing.
So there's a public element to it. It's about creating change, and people are being invited to participate.
I think too, like depending on the visibility of the fundraiser event, the visibility of the project, it might help to communicate your values to the wider community, to politicians, to other people with influence.
So that idea again of how are we also communicating this to an audience? Like that it could transmit kind of these values to a wider audience, but that would have to depend on the visibility of it. Doug, I noticed that you had definitely not advocacy response, and I'm curious if you want to share that.
I don't have a definite articulation of it. Just in my gut, I don't want everything to be advocacy, and I think it had something to do with the fundraising is the purpose of it. It maybe has an advocacy edge, but it didn't seem very oriented towards changing people's minds or something like that.
So not advocacy, or not as clearly advocacy, because it doesn't have that orientation towards broader change.
Yeah.
And maybe not like changing worldviews, but more focused on like just on raising money.
Yeah.
So Doug, I'm guessing the advocacy part for you would come before the decision to be made to embark on these projects. rather than with the fundraiser part. Am I hearing you right?
Well, that could be. I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, I think that would be on that end of things. And also, I mean, the other thing is perhaps what happens after as well. I mean, when you use the funds for whatever you use it for.
Again, the impacts of the action sometimes more than the action itself. Go ahead.
As an academic, I always go back to original definition. I have to, right? That's my world, my research. I have to look at the operational definition. It's public support for or recommendation of a particular cause or policy. So in all of the cases you've talked about, we could argue either way. Because it does imply that type of action. So it all depends on the context, right? If you give us more information about each of these statements, as Craig was mentioning, if there was information set ahead of time and there was a lot of advocacy and this was the result of it, it definitely would be it.
So much depends on the context and even how we're framing, talking about using actions in order to achieve a specific goal. Any other comments on this one? And then I'm going to give you one more example. Or one more scenario, I should say. Okay, so become a stakeholder in a Canadian mining company in order to influence their corporate environmental policy. So I'm going to repeat it again. You become a stakeholder in a Canadian mining company in order to influence their environmental corporate policy. Is this advocacy? Meh, or definitely not advocacy? All right, I'll invite you to share your thoughts. Why are you choosing this? Why are you making this choice? Why are you deciding to become a stakeholder? Actually, that wasn't the question. If you were deciding to become a stakeholder, I'm sorry, that's not a fair. Why, if you made that decision, would it be advocacy?
I think you're trying to gain influence in whatever way you can. I'm not saying it's the best way or whatever, but that is, yeah.
Your potential for making change because you're in that space is greater. Like you've got that moment for influence. Anybody else?
I mean, I'll just add in that I think about this in terms of advocacy in Washington, D.C., and that a citizen of the U.S. who's a constituent of a policy of a congressperson is going to have more influence than someone who's outside of it. So this is a matter of becoming a part of the community that can influence. Not that the others are ignored, but I've been in situations where Canadians join us or something like that. It's just or MCC, I know, sponsors people from other parts of the world to come in and talk, but it's a different kind of dynamic.
Well, and even thinking about that idea of influence or responsibility, I think you mentioned being part of that community. Anybody else? Okay, I'm going to share MCC's definition of advocacy. But before I do it, I'm going to share the definition first. I'm going to put it in the chat rather than sharing my screen, just so that we can keep seeing all of you. And I will say, I'm going to read it. Someone once came up to me after I shared this definition with them and said, this definition sounds like it was written by a committee. They were absolutely right. We are a committee. And so there's a lot of phrases and wording in here, but I've put it in the chat. I'm going to read it. And as I do, I'd like you to just pay attention to what are keywords or phrases that stand out to you and to the conversation we just had when we thought about that spectrum exercise. So a set of organized actions aiming at influencing or changing the behaviors, policies, and resource allocations of individuals or institutions that hold power for the betterment of people affected by an issue. I'll read it again. A set of organized actions aimed at influencing and or changing the behaviors, policies, and resource allocations of individuals or institutions that hold power for the betterment of people affected by an issue. So I'd love to just feel free to unmute. And is there a phrase or a clause or a set of words that kind of resonates or jumps out at you? And then how does that impact even our conversation that we just had about the spectrum exercise? Yeah, Laura, jump in.
Can I just say, I'm surprised that, well, for the betterment of people, it actually kind of leaves out the rest of creation. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, I think this was written before we were doing a lot of advocacy around climate change. I think we would probably define it a little as well, that even like people are also impacted or part of creation. And so that climate change advocacy also directly impacts the people that we care about. And so maybe a little bit of focus on people, but you're right, it doesn't actually talk about creation here. And that's something that I think we weren't considering when this statement was written. So I wouldn't necessarily say that because creation isn't here, it doesn't mean that it's not part of what we're focusing on.
Yeah.
Sandy, go ahead.
I was just gonna say what jumps out to me is the little that hold power. And that kind of goes to what Mark was saying earlier. Like if you're telling someone who's got power, great. And if you're telling someone who doesn't, it's not advocacy, but it raises this question for me of who has power. And when I think about what we need to do as a people, we need to recognize that we hold power, because we hold a lot of power that we're reluctant to acknowledge. So I think that's a kind of a critical part. And letting people know that they hold power would also be part of advocacy, or magnifying its impacts, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that phrase, I mean, I would say all of the phrases are kind of key here, but I think that idea of power and who holds power and how are we being intentional about naming who our stakeholders are when we're thinking about creating change. Both recognizing, I think on the federal level, we think, well, who are our MPs? Who are a member of parliament that have the ability to create change on issues that we care about? And how are we kind of trying to influence them, work with them to create change? But part of that, Sandy, as you mentioned, is also thinking about where do we have power as people who are doing the advocating too? And I think that's something that I think is really interesting when we think about the role of the church, is what kind of is and how the power that churches hold. And how are we identifying that, being aware of that, working within our spaces to think about what is that voice that we have? And how are we creating change in our own spaces to recognize and name that and then use that? Anything else that stands out to folks from this definition, or a clause or a phrase that seems to resonate or create dissonance?
I have a question here on curiosity. The key here is hold power. What about those who don't have power? How do we advocate for those? Because right now it sounds more like we're going to advocate to those who are in power, who make decisions. But what about the flip side? What about those who don't have the voice, right? Or even intersectionality, or all these sorts of things. How do we make sure we make it more inclusive, diverse, we also represent them?
Yeah, I think for us, this is something that we think about and try to think about for that last clause that Laura was also mentioning, for the betterment of people affected by an issue. So we are trying to impact or influence people who have power in a way that creates positive change. And so I think this isn't actually a traditional definition of advocacy. Like I think the definition, I think it was that you read, Dieter didn't necessarily include that last phrase, and that's something that MCC has included in our understanding of advocacy, because we want to be clear that our advocacy needs to create positive change that lines up with our mission statement of like right relationships. And that we need to be doing it with our partners and the people who are directly impacted by an issue. And sometimes they're the ones that end up doing the direct advocacy as well. But that we want to kind of center our work on that idea of the outcome that we want to see too is not just a shift in power, but a positive shift in power, or that influencing piece. We're actually a registered lobbyist in Canada. I love going places and just introducing myself as a lobbyist but I think for us, this part is also important then when we think about our work as a lobbyist, because there's like thousands of registered lobbyists who are also working to do organized actions that influence and create change. But for us, it's an important distinction to think about, why do we want to create this change? And for whom is it important?
So the reason I'm asking this is there's some wonderful MCC initiatives in MEDA as well, especially in Africa, where women have been empowered to create businesses.
Mm-hmm.
There was no way we could do it from the top down. Those who had power. No, we gave them the power, grassroots level, and they became prosperous and have now created these wonderful businesses where they can support their families and communities. And it did not change the top down, but it has now influenced the business companies around those communities from a grassroots level. So that's why I have a little bit of an issue with the power. There's also a flip side to the bottom up, that type of idea.
Absolutely. And I think even when we were talking about it in our spectrum activity, advocacy is one way to create change, but it's not the only way. And so when we're looking at an issue, how do we also identify maybe where like grants or contributions or other spaces are also ways of creating that change? So to do that analysis carefully around what's the issue that we're facing? What are all of the different contributing factors to it? And how are we thinking about where are we well positioned to engage? And for me in Ottawa, that's advocacy. For somebody else who's maybe in one of our country programs, it's like economic empowerment of women. But thinking about we all also play a role in creating the change.
I appreciate that this definition is pluralized and it kind of helps reframe the opening activity. I felt those were like individual activities, the blog, the candlelight, the fundraiser, joining the board. But if I now see them as a whole, a set of organized actions, that helps reframe that.
Yeah. Well, and I think we can get stuck, especially kind of in our individualized society, that it's my actions, but I think it's our actions together. And it's a set of actions as well. That it's both us working together, and then it's us trying different things together too. That I think in this paradoxically sometimes gives me a sigh of relief. And I'm like, we work on really big, complex issues where there's not one kind of like silver bullet that's going to fix things. But that means that all of us have a chance to kind of engage. We have a little bit of creativity too, to say what works, what doesn't work. But are we kind of taking our time to reflect back after we've done something and say, what did we learn about ourselves, about the people that we're engaging with? Is there something that we want to try different next time? But that idea of it being organized actions, that it's not just one thing. And who are others that we can also work with that may have similar goals, but bring different gifts, bring different perspectives as we think about that. So how does that open up space for us rather than make it overwhelming? Anybody else?
I guess just to add to that, that different types of action can reinforce each other. And, some of the things that you were talking about earlier as, is this advocacy? I mean, which I don't think are advocacy, but they can make advocacy possible because you're building the base from which the advocacy can happen. At least in the definition of power that I understand it as, which is obviously disputable. So there's kind of a pipeline there, and there's a spectrum, and we need to be looking at all of it and not just the bit at the end.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, when I look at or think of some of the activities, I wouldn't necessarily define fundraising as an advocacy activity in itself, but I think looking at how are we walking together and taking one next step. I read some Adrienne Marie Brown. She's a community organizer in the US, and she always talks about what's the next most elegant step. And thinking about what's the change that we'd like to see, what is possible within our own context to achieve that change, and what's one step that we can take in that direction. And what's the next step that we are inspired to take from that space, so that it's kind of this idea of walking together. And maybe at this moment, a fundraiser is a great idea to help us kind of even build our understanding of climate change together as a community. It's a little bit of a lower barrier to entry than setting up a meeting with an MP, but it's kind of building our muscles, helping us engage. So maybe it's not advocacy, but it's leading us along the journey. And so I think a lot of times how that piece of as well, again, organized actions and strategies, and that they don't all have to be traditional advocacy, but how are we outlining how they lead us on that journey? But a question I'd like to ask you as we think about advocacy, about influencing, about power, we're thinking about changing behaviors, we're thinking about changing policies, resources. Those are big topics. And I'm always curious or like to reflect on, how does a commitment to peace as Anabaptists impact how we engage in this? Yeah, I'd love to hear from you. When you think about what it means to be Anabaptist and all of the words on this definition, how does our peace commitment or peace witness influence us in how we engage?
I find myself going in two different directions, because on the one hand, I think it can lead to this sense of humility, and that we need to speak softly and some things like that are maybe sort of traditional Mennonite. On the other hand, I think about Mennonite action and this kind of direct nonviolent action that Martin Luther King has pushed us towards, and this that it can be a more almost the opposite direction in terms of being quite forthright or quite messy and confrontational.
So that almost that tension, and this is how my team and I talk about it sometimes, and it helps sometimes to just name it, this tension between peace and justice. And we're the Peace and Justice Office, and we often find ourselves wrestling with that, like, where are the spaces where we're building relationships? And we've got this behind the scenes ability to talk to members of parliament, to get to know them, but where are we also calling out injustice and seeking justice? And just to even name that there's a tension here. But others, I'm curious what you think about when you think about even that peace and justice tension, or how do we do this well as Anabaptists?
I would agree that you can't separate the justice from the peace. I mean, they are They are just two facets of how we're supposed to face the world. In terms of how we would implement, or how I'd suggest you implement it, I mean, you can advocate for things, I think, and still be respectful of the individuals. You know, remembering at all point that even these people that you disagree with, or maybe you are, you believe they are mistreating others, they are still God's children and still need to be treated with that optimism that not only will they change their behaviors, but maybe they will change their heart.
So speaking truth and holding the belief that people can change hand in hand. And I think I would add maybe a third element, recognizing that I can also change. So how are we also kind of learning from both the people that we're doing advocacy with and also from the people that we're advocating towards? Anyone else?
Say that advocacy for me is a bit different because I'm not just trying to speak to those in, you know, in power to make change. I feel like I'm already part of a collective, like being part of a congregation that's part of a denomination, part of Mennonite World Conference, that like we're a large enough body that we can take action ourselves, like meaningful action ourselves, sometimes even without government or other big players being on board, if that makes sense. So sometimes there's a temptation then not to engage those players and just to do some things ourselves, but also sometimes being able to move forward ourselves, like that can then influence political decisions as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe if I can paraphrase it to make sure I'm getting it, that temptation to just be like, we're big enough, we're organized enough, we're moving forward as ourselves, maybe even in something like greening our church or taking actions that it can maybe a temptation not to then engage in the advocacy political space because you're already responding maybe to a marginalized community or providing that. And so what is kind of our role as part of even that bigger collective?
Yeah, like for example, right now we're like a big focus for our churches around reparations to Indigenous communities, which is related to climate justice. And there's kind of a movement building of churches who are wanting to engage in this, but also we need to remember that like the government has a responsibility to make reparations as well. And could us making payments to Indigenous communities even then be used against them in court or something like that, that the government would feel? So it could almost be our action as a collective could be seen as a call to action to the government, but it could also potentially be counteract government action.
Or replace government options.
Or replace it, yeah.
Well, look at the churches are taking care of reparations. That means we're off the hook for kind of our collective. Yeah. I think there's a really cool example that I like to share that Citizens for Public Justice, an organization here in Ottawa, does, and they do a Lent pledge where they ask people to personally, they call it Give It Up for the Earth, personally take a climate action every day, or like commit to recycling or not eating meat. And then they write out what that commitment is and they send it to the government and they say, I've committed to this and I need you to do the same on a structural level. So looking at what are those ways that we can tie together kind of what our church's commitments are, not because we're political, but because of our theology, or sorry, partisan, and then asking the government to do the same. And how to kind of find that space.
Sometimes to be clear that like, this should be you taking action. We're doing this in the absence of your action, but that still needs to happen.
Yeah, and I think the framing that we use as Anabaptists also matters. And I think that this is also depending on the context and the situation, there's no one right way. But I think maybe it was Craig who mentioned that vinegar feeling. And when are we also calling people with a sense of hope? That we are people of hope as well. And that sometimes it takes more work for us to find those spaces of what is possible and not to hide what is terrible, what is awful, structural evil, sin, but to also invite people into our hope of reconciliation and restoration. And I think I wanted to share as just we've been doing a lot of TikToks lately because we also find this as a space of kind of creative engagement, a message that we've been sharing with the Prime Minister around climate action that we found helpful for getting Canadians engaged. And I'm just going to share it with you here. You can see my screen.
Dear Prime Minister, I am concerned about the impacts of climate change. In Canada and around the world, 2023 was a record-breaking year for forest fires, heat waves, droughts, and storms, with significant economic, environmental, and human costs. This worries me because I care about people, and climate change is causing challenges for people in every country. That's why I'm writing to you today, because I believe that Canada has a role to play in climate action, and our responsibility goes beyond our own borders. Here are two important actions we can take. The first is to cut Canada's greenhouse gas emissions by 60% based on 2005 levels by 2030, and aim to reach zero emissions by 2050, in a fair way that supports our workers and communities. The second is to increase Canada's financial support to communities around the world, like those MCC has been working with for years, who are dealing with the greatest impacts of climate change. As you continue developing Canada's climate policies, please don't forget our global neighbors. Signed, Kanogasawa.
Okay, I just have to stop it so we're not hearing like 15 TikToks in a row now. Okay. So I think that's one small example of where we're trying to bring these things together. And also think about that we're not technical experts in addressing all of the impacts of climate change, but we are people of faith who care about people in the earth. And that can be a powerful message that can also cut some of that politicization. That we're not, and I know it's not as simple or as straightforward as that, but how to be able to bring our care and concern as people of faith, as church members, is sometimes an avenue as well for our influence. And sometimes we may feel a little bit naive that we don't have all of the information or all of the research, but that is also something where there's a space between our elected representatives and us, is that passion as, I think, Canadians and especially Christians, where I think there can often be that association with people who don't care about the earth. But to be able to say, I represent this many Christians or this many people who care about others who are doing things like recycling, who are part of a Creation Care network, who are doing these things, and we'd like you to do the same, can be an opening. And so I think we're very quickly running out of time, but I think I'd like to leave that for you as maybe just a space to continue to work and engage, is that this is a space where we do have power and influence and how to use that moral voice in a way that both speaks truth and builds relationships. So Doug and Sandy, I know you want to quickly transition to the last section. I'll just highlight that we are working on creating a new advocacy toolkit for churches that has more of that technical information about how do you set up a meeting with your MP? Where are spaces where change happens? How do you create messaging? And I'd love to kind of share that with you once that comes out. We've also worked on a pastor's discernment guide for engagement with climate change that you can download from our website.
Can you
That
put
I'm
the
gonna
link
share
in the
here as
chat?
well.
for me? It's very good.
And that folks in our provinces and regions are also very happy to talk to individual churches about spaces for advocacy engagement with MCC in ways that work for kind of your congregation and the unique political context in your region or province as well. We recognize there's a huge range, even within our MCC big tent, of understandings around climate change and ways of engaging. And so there's things I can do at a national level, but the real work actually happens provincially and regionally. So I think I'll stop there unless there's any final questions or comments, but thank you for this rich time of sharing.
Yeah, and I do, if someone does have a question, we have time for at least one or two.
Maybe not for Anna, but maybe for Doug. Are there these kind of resources in the US?
Yeah, Kirsten DeMello would be there's actually a climate education and advocacy person for MCC US, based out of Washington, DC. And I think, Anna, is this connected to the Climate Action for Peace campaign? Is that how you get to this discernment guide? The MCC US and Canada are actually cooperating on a Climate Action for Peace campaign that
Okay.
has a lot of resources as well. We also have a few if you go to the ACC, we've had some advocacy kinds of efforts as well.
Yep, I just stuck the link to our Climate Action for Peace campaign in there. And that's a joint Canada and US led campaign where, again, we as MCC even really view the value of churches engaging in advocacy, especially around climate change, as something that we think creates the difference. And that when I talk to members of parliament, especially around climate change, they'll say it's wonderful that you as MCC, as a paid lobbyist, are coming here to tell me to do more on climate change, but hearing from the folks in our riding around their concern about it and that they're willing to have Canadian dollars go to supporting people internationally or to cutting carbon emissions goes much, much further than an MCC staff person saying that.
That is one question I had, Anna. Does MCC US are they called registered lobbyists too? I wasn't sure. Haven't heard that language from them. So I was just curious.
No, the tax law is different in the US. I
Okay.
think around religious organizations and how they're required to register. Whereas so I don't actually think they are registered lobbyists, but here in Canada, we are required to register.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Anna. This has been very very engaging and appreciate the way that you've done this and to get us thinking about advocacy and hopefully moving us towards advocacy. One other thing to mention is that Anabaptist Climate Collaborative is working with MCC US as part of our Earth Month activities to have a lobby day in DC on April 10th. And so Jason, you're not so far away, and Dan, you could come down. It'd be a little further for Jesse, perhaps, but we'll be organizing something both in person and those who would rather do it in their local area. We would do a hybrid kind of meeting. So that's for April 10.
Yeah, and maybe just to say, if any Canadian churches are also interested in engaging in something similar in Ottawa, we'd be happy to work with you and our provincial MCC staff to see what is possible.
Yeah.
Especially post a Canadian election.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what we're dealing with, is our post-election and the chaos around that. All right, and Anna, I mean, you're welcome to stay around, or you're welcome also to go as we move into a time of discussion. And I think what we want to do for the rest of the time is give some attention to the projects that everyone has been hopefully planning and thinking about. It occurred to me that I might just share my screen here. Oops, I don't have the right thing up yet. Let me wait on that.
While you're finding that, oh, I was just going to say thank you, Anna, and thanks from all of us.
Thank you all, and thank you for your
Yeah,
rich sharing.
I guess let's clap this way.
All right, take care, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have time to do some one-on-one discussion first, right? To break into groups of two, just to kind of rehearse what you're going to say about. Am I right, Sandy, that we have time for that, or
We have about 42 minutes until the end. So, and about 10 people here. I know there are a few who weren't doing a project, so about 10 who might share about a project. So we can divide that time however we want.
Yeah. So I think we could have about 10 minutes here, 5 minutes for each person to talk. What I wanted to show on my screen is just a reminder of this, that for those of you who don't have that in front of you, it's really number 2 is what we're hoping that you can share. What specific goal or project could you realistically aim to achieve? Actually, we would say in the next 6 months. So I guess numbers 1 and 2, in a sense, is what we'd be asking you to do. So I think we would break into groups if that seems helpful to you, just to kind of let the other person know how it's coming along and what you're thinking at this point. See if there's any honing you want to do of the project. So I think it'd be like, Sandy, it would be like 10 minutes in groups, and so 5 minutes for each person. And I guess we do need to make sure we set the timer for 10 minutes within the groups, and then that will give us about 2 to 3 minutes. We'll decide exactly what we want to do for everyone to go around and share once we're back. Does that make sense to everybody, what I'm saying?
Let's do 8 minutes in the pairs.
Okay.
Question, is the partner you had when we were together, I didn't write down who was with who, but if your partner was here, we'd invite you to go with that same person again. But I don't know who had their partner. So do you want to just quickly shout out if you see your person on the screen, and because we have to make these rooms. No one has a partner who's here.
Jason and I were together.
Okay, so can we do that again? Jason and Laura, anyone else? Okay. Well, you're going to just be randomly assigned. Mark and Yoel, you both don't have a project, right? So do you guys want to chat together? I'll throw you in a room. Okay. Where is that? Uh-oh. Breakout rooms. Where's my breakout rooms option, Doug?
Oh.
Oh no.
It should be under more, right? Yep.
Yeah, it totally should be, and it's not there.
Not there.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it either under mine.
Doug,
Who's the host for today?
Sandy.
Sandy? Okay, then.
yeah, but it's not my Zoom account, it's Doug's.
My account. Was I supposed to set this up as a breakout room meeting? I think I forgot to do that. I didn't remember that. So maybe we won't have breakout rooms.
Why don't we just share with everyone? We have 40 minutes and there are about 10 people sharing. So if everyone takes like 3 minutes to talk a little bit about what they're thinking of doing or what they're doing.
So this will mean we stop a little sooner, and I'll for next time I'll work on that. And actually, the other thing I want to say is I have a timer. So just to kind of help, I think I'll set the timer for each person for 3 minutes. So once it rings, you can know that you should stop soon after if you're still going. You don't have to use the whole time, but
and we can take a question if that gives us a little bit of breathing room. We can take a question after presentations or take some questions after.
After each one, do you think we should? Is that what you're
At
suggesting?
the end, I think.
At the end, okay.
So write down your questions if you have them.
Do we have a volunteer to go first, or will I just, yeah, okay, Dieter, great.
Hi, what we're doing in our church, our project is just to become more aware of what we've already done. We have a number of different committees and they're not communicating to each other. So we discovered we actually have a heat pump in our church. It was installed by the Physical Facilities Committee, which is great. And so that got us to thinking that what we need to do is create a website for our church, just to identify to the public what we've done. We have these beautiful solar panels on our roof, and then just have information as to what we're doing, how is it actually making an impact, and we'll also be sort of a role model in the community. And the other thing we're trying to do is provide more access to people within the community that can have use our church facilities during the week. And that's really helping offset using a facility more of an effective way. And it's bringing people to the church, which is really fascinating.
All right, thank you, Dieter. Who would like to be next? Dan?
Yeah, I'll go next, and it will be brief, so maybe it gives somebody else a little bit more time. So I looked at a lot of different things that I might want to do, and decided that the best thing to do would actually be to get together and brainstorm with other folks in our congregation and try and come up with something. So we're kind of starting from ground zero. And we've talked to folks, and we are trying to schedule a meeting for next week to actually get together and do some brainstorming. My proposal to them was that we would try and pick something pretty discrete in the next week or two, and that we would include in that we would do some organizing of content, and try and present some things to our congregation. Congregation hasn't been exposed to a whole lot of stuff specifically around climate, and I think that might be a good thing, a good place to start. I have to admit, as I've talked to some of the folks who seemed interested, there was a lot of excitement about doing something maybe inside our congregation, but then going out into the rest of the conference, or even potentially starting to work within the community more around potentially working with other churches in the community. But it's really too early to tell.
And I'm going to suggest, I wish we would have done this with Dieter and we can go back and do this, but since we have time, does someone want to make a comment or ask a question of Dan? I'll just say that, yeah, go ahead, Matthew.
Well, I don't have a question. I'm just realizing my computer battery is going to die here in a minute or two. So I'm just taking an initiative to maybe share.
Okay.
And I'll suddenly drop out of the scene here.
Okay.
But
sure.
yeah, sorry to interrupt. Maybe there's another question. So just to
go
say,
ahead,
first
Matthew.
of all, yeah, thank you. I joined here late. I wasn't at your first session there a month ago. So thank you for making it available to others of us. So my name's Matthew Bailey Dick. I live in Waterloo, Ontario. I'm pastoring at Wellesley Mennonite Church, which is more so a rural small town church near Waterloo. So with a kind of a pastor hat on, I've had some things I'm beginning to test with the congregation around some of this. I just started in this role in fall, so just it hasn't been very long in my role right now, but just testing out some ideas about different awareness raising and action possibilities. But also, I guess, aside from my pastoring work, I'm also interested, I guess, in another domain. I'm also an educator and interested in the use of some of the creative arts, I guess, to put it that way, poetry, music, and different things in terms of trying to instigate change, trying to build inspiration among us, kind of at a gut level, at a heart level. So that's kind of a personal interest for me, and wanting to explore how that might intersect with more formal mechanisms in a congregation or in a network like this. And I guess the last thing I'll just mention here, I'm also really interested in a particular possible initiative based on trail-based education, as in like walking on a trail. So in our area, we have got different trails, and I've had some experiences with kind of that pilgrimage model for how we experience kind of a transformative learning experience. And so I'm interested to maybe try out some different trail-based initiatives along these lines as well. Anyway, thank you again for convening a space.
Yeah, well, thank you, Matthew. And if you're still on, I mean, we have 45 seconds left. And someone else can make a comment, but I'll just quickly say that I'm intrigued with this pilgrimage idea, and thinking about how to bring a liturgical aspect to that is of some interest to me. Anyone else?
I wanted to ask Matthew, have you heard of I think it's called the National Healing Forest Initiative through the David Suzuki Foundation? But it's a kind of a neat initiative that brings together like forest conservation with education around and healing around residential schools and kind of Indigenous justice.
Now you get to find out what happens when we get to the end. It's not terrible. Yeah, thank you, Laura.
Yeah, the kind of the therapeutic aspects of being in a forest with justice and education and all of that. It's neat. UW just University of Waterloo just designated a healing forest.
There we go. So Dieter just put a link to that. Thank you. And I'll start the timer just to make sure we don't go too long. About if anyone wants to make a comment or question to Dan or Dieter, I'll just say with Dieter that what I appreciate about that is I do find a lot of times congregations are doing things and they're not making a big deal of it, and I do think making a big deal of it is a great idea. It tends to inspire other people to do similar kinds of things. That often, putting up solar panels sort of goes neighborhood by neighborhood. There's all this information about that kind of thing. Anyone else want to have a comment or a question for Dieter?
I think Peter Sawatsky would be excited to know that people would find out about your solar panels, Dieter, at FGMF. He's the guy who put them up, got that going.
I tried another initiative. I was hoping that our Camps with Meaning, especially Campus Sinaboya, we would take all our carbon checks from the Mennonite Conference, from all the members, and put them toward a solar farm. Because every year the Camps with Meanings uses $65,000 just in electricity alone. Can you imagine if we could recuperate that and put that back in and plus sell it and then continue building? But right now there are other initiatives that are more important, so that was not picked up.
Oh, that's a great idea. Then a comment for Dan. And it sounds like you're just getting started, and these are sometimes called green teams. I don't know what kind of language you're thinking about using, but I think it's perhaps one of the early things is just to have some worship and some education and figure out a project. Any other questions or comments?
I just think it's a great idea if you want to do it with people, to take the time to find out what they're interested in and where their skills and passions lie, because you go a lot farther after listening and harnessing that which is already there. So it's great.
All right. Well, who would like to go next? Jesse?
I'll volunteer to go ahead and go. Yes. I'm not currently pastoring a church, but one of the things I just want to appreciate Matthew, what he was sharing, because that's kind of along the lines that I was thinking. something along Forest Church where there's, whether it's sort of stages of the cross, but there's something where you're going out and doing church outside, and just a chance of movement, pilgrimage where you're moving through, but also learning. I work with students with autism and some disability too. So thinking about a way to kind of incorporate some pieces of that as well in there. So just, and one of those ways again would be using creative arts as well. So, poetry or, art, but this would probably be more of a community way of inviting the community in to do something and maybe have some church elements to it as well. But, anyway, that's sort of my idea. Not really sure how to go forward. I've gotten a lot of books and resources, but it's kind of trying to move this from the resource gathering part into the actually implementation. So that's where kind of I'm at, and I'm hoping to use this time to sort of help me to move from, into this making this actually happen, action. So, but
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Great, Jesse. Well, you can keep, yeah, I'm sorry if I interrupted.
No. One thing, we have a really large park here in Memphis, Tennessee. And so using the resources we have, just getting people, I think, outside off their phones, outside into nature, and let God sort of speak into that moment, with some, liturgical element as well. So that's, anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great opportunity as well. I mean, in that sense, there's an evangelistic element to it, at least the way I see it, that people would be more comfortable coming, going in outside and experiencing, and many of us naturally experience the Spirit in those places. And part of our idea with these projects is to, yes, try to push someone like you who's been thinking about doing this to actually do it, so that you're, not embarrassed to come back in a couple of months and say you haven't done anything or something like that.
Right.
So, and anyone else? The other thing I'll mention, oh, go ahead, Sandy.
I was just going to ask if you're aware that there's a Mennonite Wild Church ministerial that meets, and there's a group, maybe some people here are part of that, or maybe you're not, but there's a group that meets monthly. A group that meets monthly or so to explore Wild Church themes.
Yeah, I would love to know more about that. I'm familiar with a little bit with the Wild Church and Forest Church and some of the Messy Church that are, but I'm continuing to, again, it's helpful to have someone who's done it before who can kind of help guide you a little bit, so you're not reinventing the wheel.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we can,
we'll hook you up.
any of you that are interested, just email Sandy or me, and we can connect you. They're meeting next Wednesday, I think at noon. So, and Wendy Jansen leads that, and she's a Mennonite pastor in Ontario that's actually been a leader in pulling together the Wild Church network across North America.
And it's a binational group. There's Canadians and Americans in that ministry.
Perfect.
It's very cool.
All right, who would like to go next? Okay, Aiden.
Yeah, the project that I'm working on is kind of a little bit of a piggybacking off of something that's happening in our community anyways. We have a couple of bike riders in our church, and we have a very old bike rack. And so recently I was at a board meeting where it was brought up that some of those bike riders had said, hey, this bike rack's really old and a little decrepit. We kind of hoping to get a new one. And I happen to be one of the closest people geographically to our church. And even though I'm here most, if not all days of the week, I drive constantly. And so part of my project is essentially to piggyback on the fact that we're buying a new bike rack for those bike riders, is to train myself or to buy a new bike, because I don't have one currently, and train myself in getting into the rhythm of commuting here to the church by bike, with the idea that if I can't do it as a young person who lives very, very close, then how could I ever convince anybody else in our community to do that? And so yeah, and so it's like a bunch of different parts of like the new bike rack. I want to do a blessing of the bike rack, is the idea that I was actually given. The wording was given from Tim. And so once we get that new bike rack, I want the youth, because I work with our students a lot, to paint it, because we ordered it in, the Mennonite best deal possible was black, was the cheapest price. So painting it in a bright color that kind of celebrates that, hey, this is a feature and something here to be celebrated. And then trying to create or work with those bikers that we have in our community to kind of go, hey, can we like note down in some way of just like how many kilometers we bike to get here, and a way of kind of celebrating that this isn't just, oh, I commuted or I went by bike, but hey, we reduced emissions by, choosing to bike this morning. And so, yeah, that's essentially the idea is firstly trying to change myself in it, and hopefully creating a way of just not our bike rack, and that being a feature that's used at our church is not just a thing in a maintenance piece, but is a celebration of like, hey, this is part of our community living into desire to be conscious about our economic or our climate impact, and hopefully move in positive ways. So yeah.
Well, that's a beautiful idea, Aiden. And I think about Laura Pauls Thomas, who was actually in Anna Vogt's video. She's with MCC on the East Coast. Her church will do a bike bus as well, where they kind of pick each other up and kind of help each other along, so that in case you're worried about being on your own. All right, who would like to go next? Yes, Craig.
Well, I came in this morning not having any project whatsoever. I missed the back half of our longer retreat, so I confess that I've been generating my ideas. I've been listening this morning. Yeah, how does that work, right? But this past year, we had Joanne Moyer come out and do a Creation Care weekend with us, which inspired our congregation to do a green audit of our building. But what I've been noticing is our board and our trustees have really kind of have been a little bit overwhelmed and not sure where to start. So I'm thinking my project might be to kind of give a little bit more structure to what we can do to implement some of the things on the green audit that we received. And I'm thinking, green light, yellow light, red light things, as in like, here are the easy low hanging fruits that we can do, and try to categorize and help out. Here are the tougher things to do, and these are the really big things that we can do, and maybe try and find grants and resources to help our congregation do that. And also, maybe this is the big picture dreaming, is there a way that I can inspire some special fundraising or create some milestones for us so that we can celebrate what we've already done, celebrate what we're going to be doing, and maybe make some of the red light things more yellow lights instead of insurmountable tasks. So I'm in the initial brainstorming stages, but that seems like something that would give us something to do. And we are very much a congregation of wanting to do something. What can I do about this? And I think that would give us something tactile to do. And I think part of the reason why we haven't picked up some of the projects is because, yeah, there's no one really choosing to sit down and find like, what are the details of the MC Canada grant? That's out there. Why are we not taking advantage of that? What other grants are available to us? And even, yeah, like how easy is it to put a bike rack in? Is that low hanging fruit, or is that higher hanging fruit, right? We need to maybe put some insulation around our windows. Well, that maybe is a quick and easy thing to do. So that's where my thinking currently is. I think it's more about gathering the resources and empowering the congregation to make some of these changes that I think are within reach. And I got 40 seconds left.
Yeah, and again, I'll just do a quick response that I also find that like with solar panels or different things, a number of these things that you do have long-term savings, so it becomes kind of an easy sell for for if you have to do a fundraising drive or something like that, because your monthly costs go down, and we tend to get hurt on monthly costs as congregations. So there can be a double that can make it easier, I think. Anyone else want to in 8 seconds? All right. And then who would like to be next? Is it Jason?
When I had met with Laura last time, I had been talking about the funds our congregation received from the International Guest House closing because we're part of the conference that held the International Guest House in Washington, D.C. I've gotten some more clarity about those funds, and we're not going to be using it for climate change. It's going to be more toward post-migration election responses. So I have that bucket is closed for this project. But I think some of the other smaller things that I've started working on is a preaching diet that is coming from our college and young adults, possibly for this summer. I've taken some steps in that regard. And this coming Sunday in our second hour, we have a conversation about an EV charger that Virginia Clean Cities is offering. And it's already interesting. One of the comments that came to me just recently from a congregant, when they saw my hybrid, they said something along the lines of, I'm going to quote this, "Thank God it's not a Tesla, because we'd have to fire you if it was." And so I want to do some work around that.
Wait, Jason, though, what is your work around Tesla? I'm just kind of curious if you, or maybe you don't want to say.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing. I got a hybrid that wasn't a Tesla, and this person was saying,
yeah.
"Thank God you didn't get a Tesla, because we'd have to fire you if you did."
Yeah. And Mennonite Church USA has a guide about EV chargers. I don't know if you're aware of that. And even some funding as well, but it sounds like you have another source of funding, so that might be a better way to go. But they're net zero, but that's just within Mennonite Church USA. Yeah, so I think thinking about the preaching diet is what I heard you talking about. I think that's a critical part of the work, is for people to hear about it in sermons and to think about it within our spirituality.
I had a question on that. I'm unfamiliar with the term of a preaching diet, so I wonder if Jason, you might share what that is or what that looks like for you in this.
In essence, I'm saying instead of like once a year or less than that have a sermon about climate change, to have a series possibly this summer of 4 to 6 weeks, and so to build up more regularity.
Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just say that, towards the end of my pastoral ministry at Benton, I had trouble finding a text that didn't address climate change in some way, and had trouble not talking about it almost every time. There are ways to integrate it, I guess, is what I'm saying with that. And it just reminds me a little bit of a conversation Sandy and I had, because I basically agree with Dan Epteson's presentation, 2 sessions ago, about the Bible being less of a green text. David Harrell has done some good work on that, and Norman Hobble. I do think that the way we've learned to interpret the Bible is also fairly industrialized and modernized. And so I think sometimes we haven't seen things that are there. And so I just, the Bible is definitely a mixed bag, and I haven't quite decided for myself, as I think about how I interpret it, how much of it is sort of brown rather than green. Those are the words I'll use if you have a sense of what I mean. So just threw that in quickly. Let's who would like to be next? Or and is it Laura and Joe? Well, anyway, who would like to be next? Yoel, yeah, are you going to?
I don't have the project. I'm not tend to do one, but I can share something I had done last time. I mean, if you okay. So last time I had this workshop together with Dark in with the people from the US. My workshop I had that I done with my church. I'm a pastor at the Laotian church in Kitchener here. I had a series of preaching, like 4 weeks straight, using the preaching on the stewardship, God's creation, in Genesis and some other part of the Psalms that I'm using. And I think the Sunday school children for the series about, I think I use 6 weeks, even this one a bit long with Sunday school children, about save the world, plastics and those kinds of information that I do together. And we also had the new windows of the church. So we've been, talking for so long, but never done, and then kind of pushing them in that projects. Then so we have window all around that done. We have a two layer. Used to be a one layer, and change it to 2 layers that. And we we ban a plastic in the church. So as the cultural, we just love to use the water bottle in the church, like as a convenience, pretty giveaway. So and then now they install the water filter tank. So and trying to had that done. So yeah, that's pretty much that we done at Grace Lao.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that's good to hear about. Who would like to go next?
I can go. I'm at Sterling Avenue Mennonite Church in Kitchener, Ontario. And before I started the role as Mission, Peace, and Justice Coordinator in September, I had been doing a lot of reading about the concept of regeneration. And I'm going to paste a link into the chat of the map of regeneration from the Global Eco Villages Network, because I've always been really inspired by intentional communities of various forms and enjoy learning about them and visiting. And so this is like a framework that I've found to be helpful and inspiring recently. Maybe it is in your contexts too, but I think my long-term vision is to actually kind of bring together like the eco-village model with church, our current model of church, and look at where we can blend them. For this project, my focus is around food and how we can change our relationship to food and food production from being more transactional. Right now I spend most of my food money at Freshco or whatever, and thinking about how we can reintegrate it into like the whole life of our church, very holistically, like from our liturgy and worship to our community life. And I'm hoping to do kind of a pilot project around creating church supported agriculture, I guess. So rather than thinking about joining a CSA as an individual action, thinking about how we can make it a collective action as a church where we maybe a number of people from a congregation or even like a cluster of Mennonite churches in our neighborhood could become a food hub or like a drop-off point for a CSA, and how maybe a reciprocal relationship could grow from that. Because we're an urban congregation. I would love to see us engaging in like land restoration and land-based learning with our children and youth, but that's just not kind of the reality of the land that we're sitting on. And so just thinking about how we can partner with farmers, maybe a collective of congregations could be supporting like a collective of small BIPOC-led food projects, regenerative food projects. And we could go from kind of a focus in the past on a more like charitable model of, sorry.
You're all right.
You know, providing free community meals, that kind of thing. And like, that's important, but also shifting more to like a food sovereignty lens. Like, how are we as a collective making decisions about the food system that we want to see? How are we in conversation with the Waterloo Region Food Systems Roundtable? What's the role for churches in shaping our regional food system and strengthening it, especially in the wake of like tariffs and all of that? There's an interest in supporting and strengthening our regional food systems. Yeah, so right now that's starting with sort of focus on CSA, but it's much broader than that.
Yeah, no, and I like that idea of not so much of a transactional relationship with food. And Mark and Murray, were you guys going to do a project or not? I wasn't. Do you have something that you want to say? I think you're the two that are left, but I wasn't. Yeah. No.
I'll let you say something, Mark, because I apologize for my absence there. Temporarily, I had an important issue to handle, but I don't know if Mark has mentioned anything about him chairing an important team in Saskatchewan called the Climate Emergency Response Team. And we're just in that regard determining as well projects that we can move forward with. And so I was chatting with Mark virtually here a couple minutes ago about whether, you know, certain projects, I'm thinking in terms of Lisi and I going ahead with a project that would parallel with one of the CERT, if you will, proposed projects or projects that we talked about. And anyways, I'm going to let Mark, if he wants to add something to this in terms of explanation or just try and get some people's projects going in the same direction as ours, maybe convincing them. I don't know. I'll let Mark say something if he wants to.
Yeah, I mean, just to fill people in, you know, we've had this group called CERT for a couple of years, and it's been sort of an official body of the church, or that's how we set it up, so that we would have influence. But you know, we may have got a little bit of influence that way, but we lost the energy, I think, that you get by being more of an open network and almost campaign group. Not quite campaign group, but something of that sort. So we've kind of changed course a bit. You know, we'll still be officially a group that can report to the church, but we've widened out who's considered to be a member, so that we can, you know, just go ahead with whatever projects people want to do. And how that fits with this program, I'm not sure. I know Claire Hewitt Fisher was thinking about, well, you know, can she do this as her project, essentially, sort of the development of CERT into something more networky, more ground, you know, more from the ground up. But I mean, one of the things that we were talking about at our meeting a couple of Saturdays ago, and we'll be meeting again in 2 Saturdays' time, was, you know, how do we integrate the sort of the very much personal responsibility things with the things that a lot of our people find scary, like the advocacy. Is it okay if I continue a little bit?
Just a minute. I mean, we do, I'd like to try to close in 2 minutes here.
Yeah, so I mean, just one of the examples was, can we have a session on keeping things protected, so keeping things in existence. So marrying together sort of the patching of clothes so that they continue with climate policy that keeps the earth intact. So, it's very much at an early stage. So I'm not putting it forward here as an official project, but I'm thought it's, it's an idea that maybe people might have some ideas about and can help us.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, and just to build on that, so we're meeting again in a little more than a month. It's the second Wednesday, April 9. And we won't have this kind of format that time. We will be more focused on you talking to somebody, so that whatever point you're at in your project, you have someone just to help you kind of think through the next step if there's something you're coming up against. So we partly just wanted to get all the projects out there so we can support each other in that, but next time it'll be a little more focused on again, sort of peer coaching to help you make the next step in whatever you're working on. So I wanted to mention that. I also just wanted to mention that Sabonakule Ngube, who's a church leader from Zimbabwe, although which is in Southern Africa, she now lives in the US, both theologically trained and also as a development person with the Brethren in Christ Church in Zimbabwe for decades. Well, not just the Brethren in Christ Church, but more broadly as well, and worked with MCC. She'll be our speaker, so I'm excited about her bringing a more global vision to our work. And yeah, thank you so much for everything that for coming, for the work that you're putting into, the ideas that you have. It's good to see these seedlings come up. Sandy, do you need to say anything else? Is there anything else I forgot?
Sure. My closing comment would be, if you want to have more conversation with me, or I'm going to offer Doug about the project in between, or somebody else in this room, you all have each other's email address. You certainly have mine and Doug's, and I just love it when people email me and ask to talk. So that is an invitation. And to those of you watching who weren't here to share your projects, if you want to throw your project out to share it with this whole group, you can also do that by email. Send out what you're planning and what your thoughts are, and you can ask for feedback that way. Yeah, so I'd love to hear from you, and I might just reach out and bug you anyway and say hello. So yeah, it's been great to be together, and your responses are always welcome.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, see you again in a month or sooner.
Yeah, bye.